Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Ari Theriger and today I'm going to try to answer a question posed by one of my patrons: if pagans believe in a creating force outside the reality of gods and goddesses. This is a very interesting question, which cannot be simply answered with a yes or no, because there is a wondrous variety of pagan belief systems both in the past and nowadays. So it's not just a question around the belief systems of ancient pagan societies and cultures, but we also must take into account New Age, neo-pagan religious constructions and reconstructions. Also, it's important to understand that pagans of the past are not the same as pagans of today. In fact, religious perceptions change quite a lot in a couple of decades, let alone in 1,000 years. We must also never forget about cultural syncretism and syncretic faiths. And perhaps most importantly, we cannot by any means assume that mythological accounts reflect religion, because indeed mythology is not religion, but in fact, let's say it's a cultural code, always changing. Because more often than not, mythology is created to explain rituals, and rituals vary quite a lot, especially within pagan societies of the past, as such belief systems were still quite animistic. And therefore, the expression of faith and the relationships people tried to build with the supernatural sphere were always very pragmatic. Therefore, rituals varied quite often, even on a daily basis. So much of the myths try to explain and safeguard through oral tradition ritual behavior. Also, mythology and belief systems, well, it's something that has been evolving over a very long period, especially when it comes to paganisms, as we are still developing pagan belief systems nowadays, and it has always been like that. Just because neo-pagan belief systems differ from pagan ones from the past, and many rituals ceased to exist and other new rituals have been added or created, this doesn't make neo-pagan religions less or more pagan, or indeed doesn't make them less or more valid. In fact, I take the opportunity to make a side note that there isn't and never was such an idea as being a real or true pagan. Belief systems were never static and varied from place to place, region to region, century to century. The more contact several different peoples had with each other and with several different cultures, the more cultural concepts were added to the private religions and religious mysticisms of each individual and community. Paganism has always evolved with the rest of the society and continues to evolve, because it's not a question of living in the past and being able to return to the past, but always moving forward. And so the needs of each society will change, and there are always new conceptions. So pagan belief systems adapt and evolve to accompany societies. It's important to remember this, because this too has a great impact on the conception of divinities and in the conception of the supernatural in general and the invisible others and powers of the world. Also, let's not forget that if we solely focus on mythology, we will never be able to have one single concrete idea about the conception of the gods, because there never was one. Because the mythological accounts have been told and retold on countless occasions. And since much of such accounts are explanations of cultural factors and behavior and ritual behavior in general that has always been changing, naturally, several elements have been added or taken away. Many details have changed thousands of times. Even several different versions of the same stories about specific gods have been circulating at the same time and at a certain point joining together. or specific elements added to other stories. And there's the errors in transmission, errors in copying and translating accounts, biases over the centuries, and the deliberate distortions and suppressions. So we cannot really say that pagans believed or believe in a creating force outside the scope of the gods. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't, and sometimes it didn't matter at all. Same thing today within several neo-pagan religions and belief systems. Some believe in a creating force, others not so much, others don't really care, and others believe that each deity has the potential to be a creating force in a specific way. So all gods, in a way, are the creating force. It varies a lot, but I think it's important to take all of these aspects in mind, and I'll try to answer, of course, the question with a few examples. There are hundreds of thousands of different examples, but we best keep this short just to have a general idea of the conception of a creating force and to what extent the creational powers of such an entity or entities or simply powers can go. I'll develop this as I go. We are just having a conversation today. So let's see what we can come up with. And in the comments below, please do share your thoughts and information concerning the conception or conceptions of a creating force in several different belief systems. Please. Within paganism, when there is the idea of a creating power or force, this is often transported to the conception of a deity or several deities, as being entities endowed with powers capable of creating something. It's very rare in paganism, especially of the past, to have a specific single deity as the creating force of everything. Sometimes it's a matriarchal figure, sometimes it's an hermaphroditic entity, sometimes it's the father of a specific tribe, a human tribe sometimes. But occasionally such entities never create everything by themselves. There's always other elements at work, chaotic forces clashing with one another, or several entities joining powers to create something. The idea of an omnipresent and omnipotent deity, creator of all, is often an influence from Zoroastrianism. Not only and not just, but, well, Zoroastrianism did have a tremendous impact on several religions of the past, even pagan ones. After all, Zoroastrianism not only is one of the most widespread religions, at least in the past, but also the oldest surviving religion still in practice from the very moment it was created until today. And the idea of a single all-powerful deity capable of everything has, of course, influenced paganisms of the past, and more so, neo-paganisms of the present, of course, through the monotheistic religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which by themselves have been greatly influenced by one another and have their roots in Zoroastrianism. However, paganisms of the past seldom had the necessity to have a specific deity as the all-powerful and all-present force capable of creating everything. Paganisms of the past were still very animistic in the core of their belief systems. So the gods often played a secondary role in several pagan religions, or rarely played any role at all in the daily lives of pagans. Instead of an idea that gods are present all the time and constantly manifesting themselves and judging people and the fervent need to pray to them in order to obtain something from them, ancient pagans, as I said, were still quite animistic, so the gods were seen as persons of the world, certainly more powerful than most other persons, but persons nonetheless, which could be encountered in the world sometimes, and could be interacted with and called upon on specific occasions and for specific needs. But most ancient pagans relied on the persons that were closer to them and whose powers and actions had more concrete and current influence on their daily lives. I'm talking about both the visible and the invisible persons of the world, such as human persons, members of the community, of the household, of the village, but also non-human persons, such as animals, other than human persons, such as entities of weather phenomenon in general, and spirits of place, spirits of the land, entities like elves, trolls, fae folk, and also more than human persons, which can be specific gods, but also ancestors. In the animistic perception, gods are no more than persons of the world, with powers greater than other persons, and certainly greater than human persons. The ancestors themselves can achieve the category of divinity if they become powerful enough. And these ancestors may not always be persons of the world that once have been human persons, but can very well be other than human persons, specific entities of a place, of a land feature, which has become important to a community, a human community. And the more interaction a human community has with this entity of place and the place itself, the more power this entity gains, and it becomes a guardian or protector of the human community. A cult is established to this person of that specific place, and as such it becomes an ancestor of this community, which can eventually become a deity. In fact, as I've previously pointed out on another video, a recent video, I actually very much doubt that animistic societies had strong conceptions of godhood as all-powerful and all-present deities, and that in fact the conception of godhood was brought to them, to animistic societies, by the colonizers, who had very different conceptions of godhood, especially in the belief of a single, all-powerful, all-present, and all-seeing and all-knowing God. If we take into consideration that within animism in general, there's the belief that the world is populated with persons and that the great majority of these persons are not human persons, then we understand that there is the belief in powerful and less powerful spirits, or powerful and less powerful persons, and that gods are no more than persons with great power that reside in the world. As such, if a human community encounters a spirit of place and a relationship is established between that human community and that entity or person of place, the human community will obtain something beneficial from this person of place. Therefore, a continuous generational contact is formed or established, creating a cult towards this person of place. From the eyes of outsiders, from the eyes of colonizers with very different conceptions of godhood, they will see in this continuous cult to a spirit or person of place from the part of the animistic indigenous community, they will see and assume that this is a god to this indigenous community. Therefore, it is assumed this indigenous community believes in at least a god of that place, when in fact it may never have been considered a god, not in the sense we often believe in our, let's say, mostly Western societies, but in fact simply a powerful person of that place. This human community established a relationship with, and the entity of place became a powerful ancestor. So taking this into consideration, gods in an animistic mentality, and therefore also in an ancient pagan mentality, are persons of the world, invisible others with their own behavior, their own communities, their own individuality, who can sometimes interact and be interacted with, and sometimes have an interest in the matters of the human community, especially if these gods share space, share existence with humans. So they will end up willingly or unwillingly, depending on the behavior of humans and other persons of the world living in that reality, will have an active participation in the mundane matters of humans, called upon in times of great need, depending on how powerful they are and how strong is the relationship between them and those who call upon them, the human community. So not actually gods per se, but just a question of greater or lesser entities, in power, of course, eventually raised to the level of god and goddess, depending on how the religious mentality evolves and the influences of other religions, other mentalities, and cultural syncretism and syncretic faiths. One way or another, each entity, the more powerful it is, it will eventually have influence on the creation of something. Could be the creation of rain, thunder, fertility of the soils, creation of plants, trees, or even the fact that a specific entity of place controls a specific amount of non-human persons, specific animals, and through reasoning and bargaining with this entity, the human community will receive an animal sent by this entity to be butchered and consumed. So in this way, this entity has creational powers, the power to sustain or aid in the sustenance of the human community. Again, a question of greater and lesser persons in terms of power, of course. But the perception of such entities and the conceptions of godhood vary quite a lot. So some communities may continue to see greater and lesser spirits or persons, while others will assume that the greater spirits are in fact gods. And this happened a lot by the first contacts Christians have had with indigenous peoples, especially in anthropological studies. A missionary, a trader, a colonizer, a slaver, an anthropologist, whoever has a specific religious conception and a very specific belief system, and from the moment this person enters in contact with a community or society with strange and unfamiliar customs and traditions to that person, this person will try to make comparisons with what is already familiar in order to understand the behavior of the community this person enters in contact with. And more often than not, there's the perception of gods and goddesses within indigenous animistic communities, because those who have contact with such communities are comparing behavior to the religious conceptions one is more familiar with. So a greater spirit that has a specific creational power may be assumed to be the god of creation, or a creating power or force or entity outside or beyond all the other lesser gods, assumed to exist by the person who comes in contact with this animistic community or animistic communities, but with a mind influenced, of course, by its own religious reality, especially influenced by the idea of an all-powerful God who is creator of everything, the Abrahamic God, for instance, as an example. And I think one good example of this, and closer to the Western society for a better understanding, is precisely during the Middle Ages, the contact the peoples of Eastern Europe had with the rest of the world. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the accounts of Ibn Fadlan. I have like 4 or 5 different sources, but I find it very useful, the one from Penguin Classics. It's filled with important notes as well as an historical background to better understand the historical account itself. Nomadic peoples of Eastern Europe and Asia, especially of Siberia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, to this day, they still have a lot of belief systems very much animistic in the core of their beliefs. I'm using the term shamanic just as a general term for a better understanding, right? Actually, there's something very important we must take into consideration in relation to shamanic communities. The communities may believe in specific gods and other spirits, and the spiritual leader, the shaman, conducts all its efforts to occasionally communicate and interact and even be possessed by certain spirits, according to what is the need within the community, but what is also demanded of the shaman from the part of the spirits. The shaman can, may, or will create contact with known entities of the community. However, the shaman is also aware of gods and other spirits only known or knowable to the shaman itself. So this creates a whole other understanding of which spirits or gods are related to aspects of creation. Certain spirits are not known to the general public, per se, and only a specific shaman has created a relationship or several relationships with certain spirits who may or may not have specific powers that influence creation to a certain extent. And this has also happened in many pagan societies of the past. Some gods were known to the general community, to the general public, others only known to a specific person. So how do we know which gods are related to creational aspects and which ones aren't? We don't. Some gods are only known or knowable to specific people, and some gods that were known to the general public have been forgotten as well. So how do we know if certain gods or if certain pagan communities believed in a creating force or not? We don't. They may have or they may have not. It depends on their own knowledge of spirits or persons of the world and which ones were known to them. But that's not why I have spoken about this account of Ibn Fadlan. We often assume that some Eastern European and Asian societies, being shamanic and animistic to this day, that they have held on to their ancestral traditions and that nothing has changed. And that is a grave mistake. If by any chance you have the opportunity to get this one right here, you will see how much the religious beliefs of shamanic communities, especially Eastern shamanic communities, of course, have changed and how much they have been influenced by other cultures. In this particular case, of course, we are talking about shamanic communities and societies of the 9th and 10th centuries, who were, in fact, subjugated to the power of their overlords, who were Jewish. These communities were still shamanic in their belief systems, but they were under the control of Jewish overlords, including in terms of religion and language. So to what extent have their animistic shamanic belief systems have been influenced by Judaism? What type of creating forces, powers, or entities these shamanic societies have been believing in? If they believe to this day in a great, all-powerful God who is the creator of all things, how much of an animistic understanding this might be and how much Jewish influence is in this belief of a creator entity? Because indeed, certain shamanic communities to this day believe in at least one creating God or an all-powerful and all-present creating force or power. But was this belief originally animistic, or is this a Jewish influence upon these shamanic communities that have carried out this belief still today, until today? Furthermore, these shamanic tribes sought the aid of Muslims, creating alliances with the caliph. These shamanic communities were paying tribute to their Jewish overlords, and during the Middle Ages, they asked the caliph to send the Muslims to instruct them in the Quran, to instruct them in Islam, and send people to build mosques and convert them to Islam, to create alliances and overthrow their Jewish overlords. Thus, not only these shamanic communities had already been religiously and culturally influenced by Judaism, but now also very, very much influenced by Islam, willingly converting to this religion in order to have support from the caliphate, as the caliphate would certainly help those who were now Muslims. This is not something unheard of, as the exact same thing happened prior to the Middle Ages, during the ascent of the Roman Empire. Many modern pagans, especially those who are Ausothru, not heathens generally speaking, but more often than not, Ausothru religious organizations, have this tendency to want to construct the true Germanic pagan religion of old. This is an illusion. There was never a specific religion old Germanic peoples subscribed to. One particular Germanic tribe believed in something completely different from the next Germanic tribe just over the hill or on that part of the land. Some religious aspects and some gods were shared by many, of course, as they were in constant contact with each other, obviously. But there were also huge differences from tribe to tribe, place to place. And they were not by any means unified under one single flag or banner, religion, creed, or a sense of nation. They were pretty divided, and the Romans took advantage of these conflicts between tribes. Diplomacy with a specific tribe: join us and we promise to overthrow the tribe you have been having conflicts with. And so they did. They joined the Romans to defeat another tribe they had been fighting with for centuries. And the Romans did this with several tribes, several peoples, not just Germanic, but Gaulish and Celtiberian as well, so on and so forth. And from the moment a tribe joined the Romans, it also adopted their customs and belief systems, traditions, adding new conceptions, new traditions, new conceptions, and of course, rituals and more mythological accounts. Many neo-pagans are always very concerned with the Christian influences upon pagan beliefs, but what about the several other religious influences from other civilizations, other cultures, other religions? There was never such a thing as a true, unique, and original pagan religion. Never was, never will be. There's always been the exchange of ideas, crossing and circulation of information. And this has had several different constructions of perceptions when it comes to deities, and of course the ideas of a creating force or power, or even a deity of creation. And of course, let's not forget about Christian influences. In this case, the Swedish Vikings that came to these parts and came in contact with these Eastern Shamanic communities and societies, most of them were Christians, the Swedish Vikings, or were both pagan and Christian all at once. So what other religious influences these Shamanic communities have received? So that's it. Even concerning Shamanic animistic communities, especially these of Eastern Europe and Asia, we cannot assume that their belief systems have not changed and they still keep with ancient belief systems. So when they do in fact believe in a creating force or power or a specific God, a great creator of everything, how much of this belief is something actually from the animistic and or pagan past? And how much of this is actually an earlier, a later conception? It's not possible to say if or how much ancient societies believed in a creating force or deity, and when a conception of a deity was in fact brought up, and if there was the belief of a creating force before specific persons of the world were deified and also influenced by the gods of others. Continue speaking in terms of animism, because pagan beliefs have always sprouted from an animistic worldview and animistic perceptions of reality. There's also something else we must, or we should, take into consideration when there's the belief in gods, no longer as more than human persons, but clearly as entities already on the level of divinity. and also the importance of trickster spirits. I've already done a video about this, which you can see if you have the time, of course. So I'm not going to extend too much on this subject, but it's always important to remember a few points. In many cosmogonies of animistic societies, the gods are responsible for the creation of particular aspects of life, mainly the structure, or let's say the matrix of the cosmos or the universe. It's not a focus on the creational force or entity, but the gods together play the role of constructing a reality they want and deem to be suitable for their own existence. The gods play the orderly aspects of creation in many animistic cosmogonies. In the creations constructed by the gods, there can only exist what the gods want to exist and what they have created things for. So there's actually no space for change or evolution. The gods create a structural existence, and that's it. They live in it the way they want. However, that's when trickster spirits enter the scene within animism, and consequently, this is also noticeable in pagan mythologies. The trickster spirit is the agent of change. In a way, we can see it as chaos, but not just. The trickster spirits are never in accordance with the creations of the gods. So the trickster spirits force change, force evolution, break the order of the gods to make it possible for other entities to live. Basically, the trickster spirits force a change in order, breaking that order, transforming it, and making it possible for other lives to be created and to exist, making the world a little bit more habitable for others that were not included in the order of the gods. You see, trickster spirits are not understood as gods. However, they have a fundamental role in creation. Together, the gods may have influence in creation, and indeed they are creators, several creating forces or powers. But the tricksters are not gods, but still have a major influence upon creation. Usually, it's even the creation of humans, and of course other persons of the world, that were not originally included in the plans of the gods. Tricksters test and transgress the boundaries that more orderly deities attempt to establish. In this way, tricksters make new places available in which there are new possibilities outside the original plan of creation. Usually, existence is created that was never imagined nor intended by creator gods. So in animism, it's not just some gods that pose as creators, but trickster spirits also have a hand on the process of creation. And indeed, this answers in part the patron's question. If there is the belief in a creating force outside the reality of gods and goddesses. Yes, there is. The trickster spirits as more than human persons. We should also talk a little bit about neo-pagan religious manifestations. They are not more or less pagan, and each person has a different religious and spiritual approach or conception or way of seeing things. So it's also important to try to understand what modern pagans believe in, especially in relation to creating power or force or entity. I'm not going to address every single modern neo-pagan religious manifestation. Good gods, no, of course not. But in a broad sense, we can come up with a few conclusions, at least if we take a look at the neo-pagan religions that have had a great impact and a great influence in our contemporary times. Not every modern pagan believes in a creational entity. However, some do. Some pagans believe that there is a sort of a unity behind everything. Everything that is perceptible being an expression of an original unified state or factor, which is sometimes called spirit. Spirit as a term is often used by many modern pagans to avoid words like God or goddess, avoiding a conception of divinity and instead a force or entity which unified everything, and such a spirit is the very thing that has sparkled creation and all the evolutionary process. So everything immediately perceptible, including human beings, is the expression of this spirit. And I think it's also important mentioning the neo-pagan religious manifestation called Wicca, as it was one of the very first neo-pagan religions and one that has been the very basis for many other neo-pagan religions that came after, especially Gardnerian Wicca, which has influenced quite a lot of neo-pagan religions throughout the 20th century, including also through in the 70s of the 20th century, of course. Wiccans often have the belief in two deities or a duality of divine expressed as the goddess and the god. Divinity is often in male and female pair taken from many ancient cultures. So depending on the person or on the Wiccan and which culture they are more inclined to, the names of this divine pair can change, such as Ceredwin and Cernunnos, Freyr and Freya, Isis and Osiris, Persephone and Hades. You get the point. But the bases remain the same. Goddess and god. Sometimes the god is represented as a horned deity, while the goddess is represented as the Mother Earth, or the Moon, or Gaia. The latter not specifically the Greek primordial deity, but a general term often used by many neo-pagans to address the earth without any religious inclination towards the ancient Greek culture. For most Wiccans, it is the goddess and the god that form an underlying manifestation of reality, and this pair expresses a dynamic polarity of feminine and masculine forms and energies, together bringing forth all existence, or being the cause of the expression of existence. So for most Wiccans, it is the god and the goddess that are, in a way, the creating force. Of course, this generates another question, and perhaps a problem even, if Wiccans are indeed pagan, since this belief in a divine pair actually makes Wiccans more duotheists than polytheists. But then again, it depends very much on the understanding of what constitutes a pagan belief system and what makes a person pagan. Paganisms of the past were as diverse as the personalities of each people, of each person, and how each person interacted with the world. There are as many perceptions as there are eyes to see. So Wicca may not certainly be the best expression of paganisms of the past. By any means, it isn't even a reconstruction from any past pagan belief system, but it is paganism nonetheless in many aspects. Besides, there was never a true, unique and original pagan faith or religion, but instead a variety of belief systems changing all the time. However, the belief in the god and in the goddess as a unified creational force, and more often than not just a focus on the goddess, is closer to a particular kind of monotheism rather than a polytheism. And if we think about Wicca, especially Gardnerian Wicca, and the basis of its creation, we soon come to the conclusion that it is hardly a paganism at all, but instead a sort of paganization of monotheistic beliefs, especially of Christianity and Judaism. Many of the initiation rites and magical rituals in Wicca bear similarities to those of groups like the Order of the Golden Dawn and the Freemasons, which by themselves are groups and organizations whose ceremonies are very much patriarchal. And indeed, these were esoteric movements which influenced Gerald Gardner, considered the father of modern witchcraft and the founder of the tradition of Gardnerian Wicca. And many Wiccans, just like Freemasons before them and members of the Golden Dawn, also conduct their ceremonies in similar or equal ways, such as gathering in circles consecrated with symbolic implements like daggers, for instance, and purified with salt and water, greeting the four quarters and the four elements, etc. Even Aleister Crowley, not a pagan at all, but a member of the Golden Dawn, had a tremendous influence on Gerald Gardner. So you get the point, right? Gerald Gardner and his companions transformed the Golden Dawn and Freemason rituals into celebrations towards nature and the veneration of a deity who was believed to be an actual being, the goddess. So it's important to take this into mind in relation to Wicca, because since its creation, it has hardly been pagan at all, and Wicca has had tremendous influence on the creation of several other neo-pagan religious movements and manifestations who end up, like Wicca, creating a neo-pagan version by transforming monotheistic religious conceptions and patriarchal ceremonial magic and converting it and covering it with a thin layer of pagan names and terms and a few conceptions. So it is understandable, the idea of a creational force within Wicca and several other neo-pagan movements that came after, based on Wicca, very much based and influenced on Wicca. And often the tendency to manifest this creating force into the figure of a deity, in this case, the goddess, or the pair of god and goddess, often seen as a unified force of creation. And this would greatly influence the creation of Ásatrú in the 70s, which is no more than a Wiccanization of Germanic beliefs. And the god Odin often plays the role of this unified force, a creating force, often referred to as the All Father, the king and father of all the gods and mankind. Something that comes in later Icelandic sources and very rarely on early Skaldic poetry, but as being already a Christianization of the figure of Odin. So indeed, there's this aspect within some neo-pagan religious manifestations and this idea of creating force expressed in the figure of a deity, which hardly expresses a pagan understanding, let alone an animistic perception of creator entities and what constitutes personhood. Wiccans, just like Hindus actually, confidently state that there is ultimately one divinity, even though they venerate all of its manifestations. You see, polytheism is a synonym of paganism. Not every pagan is polytheistic, and not every polytheism is a paganism. A religion can be polytheistic solely because it contains many gods in it, or the veneration or worship of many gods. But many polytheistic religions are a form of monotheism because the gods are understood as several manifestations of one divinity or one ultimate creating force or creator entity. And that is not, by any means, a paganism, and certainly not an animistic worldview at all. So it's important to take this into consideration so we may understand the religious influences that lead the belief or not in a creating force or entity or several creator entities or persons. And just to finalize this, I would like to make a point on heathens, not Ásatrúar, but heathenry or heathenism. The polytheism expressed by heathens is far more explicit than the one expressed by most Wiccans. And polytheism within heathenry, more often than not, also expresses a pagan understanding, as deities within heathenry are often understood to be unique, separate entities, and not several manifestations of an ultimate divinity. Each entity within heathenry one way or another, is endowed with specific powers that can be conducted towards creation, if they so wish. Not every deity within heathenry is understood to be a creator deity, but many aspects of the deities express a creational power of sorts. Could be the fertility of the soils, could be the growing of crops, vegetation, the very rain and wind, the fire and the heat. So let's say contributing factors that help in the creation of life, but also its destruction at times to renew the cycles of life and give way to new creation. Besides, in heathenry, polytheism is very extensive, and deities are often considered much like humans and other living beings in the world, with their own individuality, behavior. So it's actually a polytheistic expression rowing towards animism rather than a focus on entities as ultimate expressions of creation, making heathenry a modern religious manifestation closer to paganism, and indeed trying to be a pagan reconstructionism, unlike most also through religious organizations. But then again, it depends very much on the perception of each individual. The important thing to take from all of this talk, I think, is that there are pagans of every kind, of every sort, many different types of pagans, such as it has always been. There are even pagan atheists, which seems like an absolute nonsense, but it's true. They do exist. But that's something for another time, perhaps. Still, I do hope you got to the point. Some pagans believe in a creating force or entity, others believe in several creators, others not so much, others just don't care, and the gods and goddesses don't even play a primary role or any role at all in their expressions of faith and belief systems. Alright, my dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed today's video. May it be useful in your pursuit of knowledge and in your studies of religions and spiritualities and whatnot. And as I've seen other YouTubers saying, let me give it a try to see if it helps. Smash that like button, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, comment on my videos, share my videos, tell your friends, bring your grandmother, go into the woods and make a ritual circle with your cult buddies at the sound of one of my videos. It helps. Or go out into the streets with your phone or laptop or any electronic device and bother poor innocent people by showing them my videos and tell them to subscribe to prevent the old ones from breaching the boundary and invade our world. Whatever it takes to help this community growing, I guess. I don't know. It's worth the try, I think. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för det. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.